Pro et Contra.
Today we have lots of very interesting updates, and as you know, the most important updates are coming from the area of Chasov. And according to information we have, the Russians started an assault operation on the eastern block of the city by the name of Novy or Canal. So this area has two titles. As you can see, we have lots of geolocations. One of the geolocations about the Russian attack we have already discussed in the morning, and today we got more details and more updates about that attack. And now everything become, at least to me, became clear about the attack, whether the Russians managed to achieve something or not, and what kind of things and what kind of tricky things the Russians were using during the attack. So let's discuss this attack once again, and I'll give you a very interesting details. First of all, let's launch the video once again, and on this video we can see the Russian attack. These are, let's say, Russian armored vehicles heading towards the Ukrainian positions. The video was published by the 67th Mechanized Brigade. The Russians, as you can see, were using just light vehicles without tanks, just light vehicles. So the Russians knew that there were going to be no probably anti-tank fire or something like this. The Russians were very fast. The Ukrainians, as you can see, at some point start bombing and attacking the Russians, but most of the strikes the Ukrainians basically missed. And this is the final part of the video we have. If we return back to this video, I would like to point your attention to this personal carrier. This is it. This is one. So as you can see, at some point, one personal carrier, this one, let's say, turned and start moving towards Chasov. So if we make some analysis, we're gonna understand that during that attack, just one personal carrier with infantry or assault troopers moved further in direction of Chasov. And on these positions, we can see the first Ukrainian positions, the first Ukrainian soldiers who met the Russian armored vehicle and tried to stop the Russians with, let's say, rifle fire, short rifle fire with anti-tank strikes and something like this. But the Ukrainian attempts didn't stop the Russians. They managed to reach the line, they landed the infantry and probably captured the trenches. And then the personal carriers returned back, those let's say 10 or 9 that left. The Russians start clearing the trenches and captured them. So this is like a short story, and of course based on that video, most of the mappers, most of the Telegram channels start building their own projections, speculations, updates, posts saying that the Russians managed to establish control over Kiev as a result of that attack. I'm joking, of course. So first of all, let's get deeper into details, and you're gonna understand exactly what did happen and what the Russians were planning to do by attacking this part of Chasov. For these purposes, let's play the video, some part from the beginning. And on this scene, once again, we can see significant number of armored vehicles. If we calculate the number, there were around 10 armored vehicles that were attacking the Ukraine positions. And this is the first important thing that you need to understand. There were 10 armored vehicles, but very likely just 2 or 3 were with infantry on board, and 7 were empty. This is very important because from this perspective, when we see significant number of armored vehicles, we imagine a very, let's say, broad frontline, full-scale offensive operation with significant number of soldiers, up to 100 or even more. But when getting deeper into details, we understand that there were just 3 personal carriers completely fully loaded with infantry and assault troopers on board, and 7 or something like this. 70% is better because it's very difficult to understand the real number of, let's say, vehicles. 7 were empty and 3 were fully loaded with soldiers. And if we continue watching the video, we see that just one armored vehicle moved further to Chasov. So if we are saying that there were 3, the question is where the other 2 armored vehicles moved when this armored vehicle, the first one, moved to Chasov. The thing is that right before I start making the video, we got another detailed video of that attack, but a little bit from another angle, and that video was completely about the second group of Russian armored vehicles. This is the second part, basically the same video, but from another drone of 67th Brigade, from another angle. On this video, on this part, we can see once again the Russian personal carrier that left the convoy and started moving further to Chasov Yar, but the rest of the armored vehicles proceeding further along the tree lines towards Bogdanovka and along the railways. And the main goal of that group was to land infantry in this area. So now let's summarize everything, and for better understanding I will give you step by step how the Russians were moving and what they were planning to do, and what are they going to, and the most important, what the Russians are planning to do next. So the Russians were moving along 0506 road, and when they reached the new cemetery, the Russians decided not to continue moving further along the 0506 road, because very likely it was too dangerous to continue offensive along this area. Very likely the Ukrainians still have some positions along the railways. So basically the Russians were afraid of being attacked with let's say anti-tank missiles in the Russian flank, so that's why they turned to the south and started moving on the southern, let's say, part in the southern, let's say, area of the new cemetery. So the Russians continue moving something like this. Then the Russians reached the how to say, the end of the Popovo forest, and on this area the Russians turned to the bottom, to the south once again, and the Russians crossed this tree line. This is very important detail, and this is very important because the Russians crossed this tree line. They decided not to move on the top, let's say, side of the tree line. They decided to move on this bottom side of the tree line, and probably the reason of that is that Ukrainians still have control over the railways, and the Ukrainians had chances to attack the Russians if they were moving, let's say, on the northern part of the tree line. So the Russians were moving something like this almost until, not almost, but until the end of the tree line. They crossed another tree line, they entered 0506 road once again, and on this area, exactly on this, in this part of the convoy trip, the Russians split the convoy into two parts. So that was, let's say, the movement. The Russians were moving something like this. They moved to the bottom, down to the west, again to the bottom, to the west. In this area they split the group in two parts, and one of the armored vehicles proceed further to Chasov Yar, where the Russians landed their infantry, and the clashes started on the first streets, among the first streets and the first buildings of the eastern part of Chasov Yar. And exactly in this area, during the video, you could see, I shown you this, the first Ukrainian soldiers who were located in this part of Chasov Yar and who met the Russians with short rifle fire. So they start attacking the Russians. Later in the same video, we saw destroyed Russian personal carrier that arrived in the area and landed the Russians. It's very difficult to understand how exactly this battle finished, but as I understand, the Russians did manage to establish control over the trenches. The Russians managed to dig in deeper, and very likely the clashes on this direction continues. That personal carrier was destroyed. So that was the first group in the number of one personal carrier who was sent to this part of Chasov Yar. And the second group, according to the video, continue moving further along the tree line, along the railways, and they landed the second batch of the soldiers a little bit further to the north. But if you take a look at this video, you're going to see that armored vehicles, personal carriers didn't stop. They continue moving, and just two of them stopped in the area and landed the infantry. So the second batch continue moving here, and somewhere in this area the Russians landed another group of soldiers, and those soldiers started moving along this short road towards residential area that located on the northeastern part of Chasov Yar. And after that, the let's say the Russian convoy moved further to Khromovo and probably returned to the mainland. So something like this took place on this direction. Now these, let's say, updates, these details give us a better understanding of the situation, what did happen. So the first group, the main purpose of the first group that landed in the area, and to tell the truth, most of the Russian Telegram channels start providing information that the Russians, as I was joking in the beginning, have already captured Kiev after they landed in this area. Of course, a joke once again. The Russians, according to them, continue moving further to the west in direction of the Gorbatova Street and Zelenoye Street. This is 0506 road, is basically Zelenoye Street, and this is Gorbatova Street. And according to some Russians, the Russians managed to establish control over this part of a high-rise building, which is very unlikely that 7 Russian soldiers, maybe 10 Russian soldiers, maybe managed to establish control over high-rise area of the eastern part of Chasov Yar. But which is most likely the main Russian attack took place exactly on this line, and the Russians were heading towards this part part of Chasov Yar, because there is no high-rise buildings. There are lots of, let's say, small buildings which are much easier to capture, which is much more easy to establish a stable foothold in the area, and the most important, to establish control over the railways and to start, let's say, threatening the armed forces of Ukraine inside of Bogdanovka. So that was the main Russian goal, let's say, attempt to attack, and the main purpose of this group was just to force the Ukrainians to pay attention on them, to block the Ukrainians, not to allow the Ukrainians to send additional reinforcements to the forest. So that was like something like not a false flag, it was something like unexpected attack with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to pay as much as possible attention exactly to this group. Meanwhile, the second group continued moving along the forest towards the northeastern part of Chasov Yar. During the before that attack, the Russians, of course, were bombing and attacking the area heavily. The Russians were bombing the forest, the Russians were bombing Chasov Yar itself, the Russians were bombing the area along the railways, and the Russians were bombing exactly the area in the residential part, in the low, let's say, small, in these among these farms and something like this. Very heavy explosions. Let's say the Russians were clearing and preparing the area, and the most important, the Russians try by those attacks, the Russians were trying to hide their real, let's say, plans and their real goals about the area. So the Russians were bombing everything. They were bombing everything, and among, let's say, everything, there were few important points where the Russians were planning to move on. Also, among these strikes on the eastern northeastern part, so as you can see, the most let's say the most of the attacks, most of the bombings took place on this area. The video is geolocated here, took place here and took place here, so exactly as close as possible to the second Russian road of attack, which was the most important one. Also, the Russians were bombing this block itself, the farthest positions of armed forces of Ukraine, the farthest building, which probably was used by, or was still using by the Ukrainians as the command center, as, let's say, a navigation center, maybe as the main evacuation point, to stay as close as possible to Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and when time comes, to be as close as possible to the main supply, support evacuation roads, and to run away from the area. Anyway, the sources are saying that the Russians managed to capture the radio signals, radio conversations between the Ukrainians who are located in this part of canal with the Ukrainians in the central and the western part. There are lots of Ukrainians, as we understand, but every second, every single minute, there are more and more wounded soldiers. So that's why the Ukrainians always need a properly established, let's say, mechanism of evacuation. But the Ukrainians from the central part and from the western part reported or answered to the Ukrainians in the eastern part that currently there is no possibility to evacuate, and if you want to evacuate anybody, you need to do this by your own hands and by your own, let's say, forces and your own resources. So the situation is critical, and once again, very likely the Russians are going to storm and start the battle for Chasov Yar from the northeastern direction, but not from the central eastern direction. Obviously, we're going to understand this and going to receive more details during the next few days, and then we're going to understand everything about the situation. Furthermore, another evidence in this theory is that we also received significant number of updates from Bogdanovka itself. Today, the Russian sources published the video. We will not watch the video due to casualties among Ukrainian soldiers. The Russians intensified their fire in Bogdanovka itself. There were a lot of explosions, FPV drone strikes, artillery strikes, mortar strikes, and in the final part of the video, we see how the Ukrainians raised white flag, asking and begging Russian for mercy and asking them to take them as the prisoners of war. Very likely they were captured, and very likely another Ukrainian stronghold, another Ukrainian position in Bogdanovka was abandoned or captured by the Russians. And as I understand, the current configuration of the front line in Bogdanovka doesn't correspond to the reality. Very likely the Russians have much bigger progress on the direction. Anyway, once again, to summarize everything about the Chasov Yar, yes, the battle for Chasov Yar started, but as we discussed in the previous video, the Russians are moving according to certain pattern. And if we compare the battle for Chasov Yar and Bakhmut, we can see a lot of common things. If you remember, the battle for Bakhmut started didn't start with the battle for Solidar. The battle for Bakhmut didn't start for the battle for Klishchevka, Zaitsev, Radovka, and many different things on the southern flank of the, let's say, the town. The flank attacks was the consequences of the most important operation the Russians conducted, and the first operation the Russians conducted during the battle for Bakhmut Bakhmut was the establishing and capturing the foothold along Patrice-Lumumba Street. That was the first Russian gains in Bakhmut, and after the Russians captured Patrice-Lumumba Street and the industrial area around this area, the Russians started offensive to the south on the flanks and to the northern flanks. So when we try to, let's say, analyze and try to compare the operation in Bakhmut to Chasov Yar, we see the same pattern. Now the Russians are trying to establish control over this part. Let's say it's Patrice-Lumumba Street in Bakhmut Avdiivka, Bakhmut Artyomovsk, and after that they will start to attack on the southern flank and on the northern flank, trying to encircle, establishing operational encirclement, cutting the main supply roads, and then to create a cauldron for the Ukrainians. So this is the situation. The next days we're going to receive more and more updates from the territory. Now we are moving to Siversk area, another hot point in the special military operation. The Russians continue pummeling Razdolovka with significant number of different types of artillery systems. The city, the town, the village is under very heavy fire. This is important stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russians are about to start to launch the ground operation, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a week, but Razdolovka is going to be the next target for the Russians, and after Razdolovka the Russians will reach the operational space and will start moving further to the north in direction of Fedorovka, Perezhnya, Kuzminovka. Bilogorovka. Very interesting details are coming from this another stronghold and the base of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade received. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published another video how they managed to improve their positions on the bottom, on the base of the landfill. The Russians were moving something like this along these tree lines, along these brushes. There is not just brushes, there is a rich developed network of the fortifications, and today the Russians published geolocation of their let's say point control over this territory. So we have adjusted the map. So as we can see now, the Russians are trying to move, let's say, along, let's say, eastern base of the landfill, and the Russians are trying to bypass the landfill from the south and further to the southwest. So the same story, the Russians are just trying to encircle. So let's assume that this is small Chasov Yar, and the Russians are trying to encircle Chasov Yar, this small landfill, from one direction, from another direction. And the most important goal and the most important thing the Russians are trying to get is to get as close as possible to the main supply area of the landfill, and we're talking about this part. So after the Russians can cut the main supply roads, the Ukrainians probably will resist on the landfill for another few days, and then either they will surrender or they will stay there for the entire time, for eternity. And then the Russians will capture, of course, the landfill, and after that there are going to be no more barriers for the Russians to establish complete control over Bilogorovka and to move further to Siversk from the northern direction. I must say that according to the entire picture, according to configuration, very likely that the days of Bilogorovka are numbered. For now, we don't see significant progress, but as I understand, the Russians will not count the losses, but they will bypass this area and they will start moving to Siversk from the north and eastern direction. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. We have lots of reports, lots of updates, and the most important is that according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Vadiana. So it's very important to understand the borders of the settlements and towns in the direction. Vadiana starts somewhere here, let's say in the vicinity of Stepova Street, and then Vadiana goes along Naberezhnaya Street very far to the west, and this is the final point of Vadiana. So this entire area was captured. The town or village to the south of Naberezhnaya Street is Pervomayska, and where there are still Ukrainians, and the Russians are going to storm this area very soon. So today the Ukrainians tried to counterattack the Russians, and we have already discussed this video in the previous update. The Ukrainians concentrated a significant number of armored vehicles, personnel carriers, infantry, and they sent them to attack the Russians along Naberezhnaya Street. But to tell the truth, the operation was ended without even being started by the Ukrainians, because as soon as the infantry landed, the Russians start pummeling and clearing the area with all types of weapons they have, and the Ukrainians having significant losses. Those who managed to survive were forced to fall back, and after that we got report from the Minister of Defense about complete control over the territory. Different mappers continue updating the area around these, let's say, positions, and according to most of the mappers, this approximated the Russian control on these directions. Significant progress, obviously, and once again the Russians are getting closer and closer, not just to finish, let's say, Pervomaiska, but to finish every single village and settlement populated area on this direction: Pervomaiska, Nitailova, Yasnobrodovka, and Umanskaya. No reports, no updates from Berdych. A few more FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian vehicles in the direction. Nothing special. The Ukrainians still control the main part and most part of Semyonovka and Berdych as well. We got also a little bit additional progress of the Russians along Centralnaya Street in Semyonovka. Few more buildings were captured, and today we got geolocations from the Ukrainian side of FPV drone strikes against the Russians. And we have a certain Russian activity and certain Russian interest towards Ocheretina. Another video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian strongholds in this residential part, and this is probably the third video during the previous 5 days, and we see certain Russian focus. So the Russians are very interested on this direction, on this, let's say, residential area, because the most important that this, let's say, intersection of all these railways are located on the hill, and the Russians are trying to capture the hill and then to establish control over the territories around the area. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Krasnogorovka. The Russians, after a very long operational pause, renewed their offensive operation, their attempts to establish control over the southern part. We have lots of FPV drone strikes by the Russian soldiers. The Russians were targeting and destroying the Ukrainian FPV drone operators' positions, trenches and fortifications. We have another FAB 1500 arrived in the area. Very heavy explosion. The Russians attacked the area during the night period of time. This is FAB 1500. Of course, a very powerful strike. Imagine yourself that this is FAB 1500, and very likely less than in 3 months or maybe 4 months we're going to start receiving the first geolocations and first videos of the use of FAB 3000, and very likely that after we start receive these updates, the days of the entire special military operation will be numbered. And we have few more bombings of the residential area to the south of the railways. It looks like all these geolocations look like artillery preparation before further offensive. And we have few Ukrainian geolocations of FPV drone strikes against the Russian, let's say, abandoned armored vehicles. Maybe the Russians have already conducted something on the direction. On this video we see another Russian tank abandoned and destroyed by the Ukrainians. On this video we might see the, let's say, another Russian personnel carrier. So these two videos and these geolocations tell us that very likely the Russians were trying to attack Krasnogorovka once again. We still haven't received videos confirming this. Most of those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians probably, and but anyway, something happened here. Something happened here during the previous 48 hours, and I expect that soon we're going to receive more details and updates about the attack. Georgievka, interesting situation. As you have mentioned, as you may noted, that the Russians stopped any offensive operation in the direction. No geolocations, no updates, and it's very weird because the Russians at some point stopped completely, and very likely that the map doesn't correspond to the reality. As I understand, the Russians managed to move further, and as I understand, most of Georgievka is already under Russian control. Very likely the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from the area, and now we see that the Russians are moving focus further to Maximilianovka. We have lots of explosions, lots of FABs, lots of destroyed artillery systems. So I think that Georgievka is covered with the fog of war, and very likely soon we're going to receive more details. Novomikhailivka, no changes during the day. Ugledar, few more and additional FABs on the coal mine, very heavy explosions. Another day, another FAB in Ugledar direction. All these things confirms us and tell us that very likely the Russians are going to start the ground operation, and they're going to do this very, very soon, because as I understand now, the Russians are just trying to synchronize. Maybe this is the reason why the Russians haven't launched any offensive to Ugledar and the coal mine, because they, let's say, the forces in Novomikhailivka waits when the Russians will complete the preparation in Ugledar, and as soon as this site will be finished, preparation will be finished, the Russians will capture Novomikhailivka, and then these forces will attack Ugledar. So they want probably to synchronize two front lines and to act together, and let's say to finish the battle for the South Donetsk direction together, and to deal as much as possible damage also together. Угледар Старомайорского урожайня. We have additional, let's say, FAPs, additional pummeling, additional aviation bombings of the area to the south of Urozhaina and the area to the southwest of Staromayorska. Once again, the Russians are too active on this direction as well. Once again, if we increase the numbers of updates even from the beginning of the month, we don't need even to add the updates from March. We see a very big Russian activity, and very likely the Russians are going to start the ground operation within the next week, or maybe a little bit more, or maybe even less. Robotina, nothing during the previous 24 hours, which is weird. Completely, the Russians stopped any attempts to attack completely. The Ukrainians, well, they're not even trying to counterattack. So complete absence of any activity on the direction either from the Russian and from the Ukrainian side. Nothing interesting from Kherson. So this is the situation on the ground. We have few more updates. The Russians finished another batch, the creation of another batch of Su-34, and they sent, let's say, probably 3 Su-34 to the army. In the next few days, they're going to send additional 6 machines. We have, during the previous night, Ukraine attempt to attack Rostov-on-Don with significant number of drones. Most of them were brought down by the Russians as a result of air defense work, so the Ukrainians haven't managed to do any damage. The Ukrainian sources claims that they managed to destroy in the area of Engels, in the Engels airfield, probably 6 Russian aircrafts to deal them significant damage, but yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that. We have a lot of updates from Ukraine itself, the NATO, and Stoltenberg personally himself saying that for now NATO doesn't see Ukraine in the part of NATO. So we see that the situation is getting worse and worse, and the most important, the United States of America don't want to support Ukraine anymore. They want to finish this war as soon as possible. They want to have some gap, some time between the end of the elections and the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Maybe after they will do something, but for now they need to finish this, and they need to force Zelensky to do this. But Zelensky, we see that he doesn't want to start any negotiations with Russia, and of course this situation plays completely in Russian favor, because for now everything develops completely on the Russian side. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.
Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe.